faster, could maneuver more aggressively, could call for reinforcements, carried sensors specifically designed to track submarines, and operated in an environment where they had every advantage while submarines had almost none. A submarine that allowed itself to be drawn into combat with a destroyer accepted conditions that virtually guaranteed the submarine's destruction, and the submarine graveyards scattered across the Pacific seabed testified to what happened when commanders forgot that fundamental truth or allowed aggression to override judgment. The standing orders issued to every submarine in the Pacific Fleet were explicit: engage merchant shipping, avoid unnecessary contact with warships, and never, under any circumstances, deliberately engage destroyers unless absolutely necessary for survival or unless the tactical situation offered overwhelming advantage that justified the risk. Destroyers were to be treated as apex predators in an environment where submarines were hunters of merchant ships but prey to purpose-built anti-submarine vessels, and the career of any commander who repeatedly engaged destroyers in situations where evasion was possible would be brief regardless of whether those engagements resulted in sinkings or survival. The rule existed because experience had proven it correct, because submarines that fought destroyers tended to die, and because the strategic value of preserving submarines for attacks on merchant shipping far exceeded the tactical value of occasionally sinking a destroyer. Samuel Dealey understood these rules perfectly, had been taught them by instructors who had survived the early years of the Pacific War through careful adherence to doctrine, and had followed them himself during his initial patrols when Harder operated in waters where Japanese anti-submarine forces were active and competent. But understanding rules and following them were different things, and somewhere in the calculations that occupied Dealey's mind during the seconds when he watched those destroyers closing on his position, he made a decision that would define his career and change the tactical dynamics of submarine warfare in the Pacific. The rules were written for commanders who thought defensively, who prioritized survival over impact, and who believed that submarines won by avoiding losses rather than inflicting them. Commander Samuel Dealey. Samuel David Dealey came to submarine command through the standard path of Naval Academy graduation, surface ship assignment, submarine school qualification, and progressive advancement through the ranks that characterized most submarine officers of his generation. But the mind he brought to command was anything but standard in its willingness to question doctrine and seek tactical advantages in situations where other commanders saw only risk. Born in Dallas, Texas in 1906, he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1930 during the interwar years when the Navy was small and promotion was slow, and ambitious officers had to distinguish themselves through performance rather than simply surviving the routine rotations that peacetime service demanded. His early career showed competence without brilliance, steady advancement without the dramatic achievements that marked some officers for rapid promotion, and a reputation among peers as someone who thought carefully about problems and approached challenges with methodical analysis rather than intuitive leaps. The transition to submarine duty came in the late 1930s when Dealey qualified for submarine service and began the training that would shape his understanding of undersea warfare, learning the technical details of submarine operation and the tactical principles that governed how submarines engaged enemy forces and evaded detection. The doctrine he absorbed during those years emphasized caution and patience, teaching commanders to think of submarines as stealth platforms whose greatest weapon was invisibility and whose primary objective was survival to continue operations rather than spectacular individual victories that might cost boats and crews. Submarine warfare as taught in the late 1930s was defensive by nature, focused on avoiding detection and picking opportunities where submarines held advantages rather than forcing engagements where surface forces could bring superior firepower and speed to bear. When war came to the Pacific in December 1941, Dealey was serving as executive officer aboard submarines conducting defensive patrols, watching as the initial months of combat revealed how unprepared American submarines were for the war they would have to fight. Torpedoes failed to detonate even when they struck targets perfectly, depth controls malfunctioned and sent weapons under targets or caused them to run too shallow and strike hulls without exploding, and American submarines operating under peacetime doctrine discovered that Japanese anti-submarine forces were competent and aggressive and perfectly willing to hunt American boats with the same determination that American forces would later apply to Japanese submarines. The early war years were brutal learning experiences that cost dozens of American submarines and thousands of lives, teaching survivors that the pre-war doctrine had to evolve or the submarine force would be destroyed before it could impact the outcome of the Pacific campaign. Dealey received command of USS Harder in 1943, taking over a Gato-class submarine that had completed several patrols under previous command without particular distinction, and from his first days as captain, he made clear to his crew that Harder would operate differently than most submarines in the fleet. The philosophy he articulated was simple but radical for submarine doctrine of that era. Submarines that ran from every threat would never accomplish anything significant, survival was important but impact mattered more, and the way to win the submarine war was not by avoiding risks but by taking calculated risks that other commanders would reject as too dangerous. He trained his crew to think offensively rather than defensively, to look for opportunities where conventional wisdom saw only threats, and to understand that aggressive action often created its own advantages by forcing enemies to react rather than execute their own plans. The crew that served under Dealey learned quickly that their captain would take Harder into situations that other commanders would avoid, that patrols under his command would involve combat rather than observation, and that the risks they would accept were higher than those accepted by most submarine crews, but that the potential impact of their operations would be correspondingly greater. Dealey demanded excellence in every aspect of submarine operation, from maintenance to navigation to torpedo-firing solutions, because he understood that aggressive tactics only worked if execution was flawless, and if the crew could perform under pressure without hesitation or error. The reputation that developed around Harder was that of a boat that hunted rather than hid, that sought combat rather than avoiding it, and that operated according to principles that emphasized initiative over caution and impact over survival. By mid-1944, when Harder departed on the patrol that would define Dealey's legacy, the submarine had already established a combat record that distinguished it from most boats in the Pacific Fleet, sinking merchant tonnage and demonstrating tactical capabilities that earned respect from submarine command, even as some senior officers worried that Dealey's aggressive approach would eventually cost him his boat and crew. The question that hung over Harder's operations was whether aggressive submarine warfare could be sustained over multiple patrols, or whether the odds would eventually catch up with commanders who took risks that doctrine warned against. And the patrol that began in June 1944 would answer that question in ways that would reshape American understanding of what submarines could accomplish when commanded by officers willing to break rules that were written to prevent exactly the kind of combat Dealey was about to initiate. USS Harder, built to fight. USS Harder belonged to the Gatto class, the standardized fleet submarine design that formed the backbone of America's Pacific submarine campaign and represented the best balance between capability and production efficiency that wartime shipbuilding could achieve. At 312 feet long and displacing 1,500 tons surfaced, Harder was neither the largest nor the smallest submarine in the American fleet, but the design incorporated lessons learned from earlier submarine classes and provided capabilities that made Gatto-class boats effective platforms for extended combat patrols in distant waters where support was minimal and self-sufficiency was essential. The submarine could achieve 20 knots on the surface using diesel engines and 9 knots submerged on battery power, ranges that allowed transit across vast Pacific distances and sprint speeds that could close on targets or evade slower pursuers, though the speed advantage disappeared entirely when facing destroyers whose 30-knot capabilities made them uncatchable for any submarine regardless of how skilled the crew or how well-maintained the engines. The armament that defined Harder's offensive capability consisted of 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, loaded with Mark 14 torpedoes that had finally, after 2 years of combat and hundreds of failures, been modified to actually detonate when they struck targets and run at proper depths rather than passing harmlessly under enemy ships or striking hulls without exploding. Each torpedo weighed 3,000 pounds and carried 600 pounds of high explosives in a warhead designed to rupture ship hulls below the waterline, and a properly aimed spread of 3 or 4 torpedoes could sink merchant ships or damage warships seriously enough to remove them from combat operations. The submarine carried 24 torpedoes total, enough for 2 or 3 major engagements if every torpedo was used and if reload times between attacks allowed the crew to replenish tubes before the next engagement began. But torpedo loadouts were finite and every shot fired brought the submarine closer to the moment when tubes would be empty and combat capability would be reduced to evasion and return to base for rearming. The submarine's defensive capabilities were minimal by design, because submarines were not built to fight surface ships in direct engagements but to strike from stealth and disappear before enemies could retaliate. A single deck gun provided some capability for surface combat against unarmed merchant ships or emergency situations where submerging was impossible, but the gun was useless against destroyers whose superior firepower would destroy any submarine foolish enough to remain on the surface in gun range. The submarine's real defense was its ability to submerge to depths where surface ships could not follow, to run silent and minimize noise that sonar could detect, and to evade through maneuver and patience until pursuing ships lost contact or abandoned the search. Harder could dive to test depth of 300 feet and could exceed that depth in emergencies when crew and hull integrity were willing to accept risks that came from pushing past design limits. But depth provided only temporary protection against destroyers that could bracket probable positions with depth charge patterns calculated to kill submarines even without precise location data. The crew that operated Harder consisted of 80 officers and enlisted men who lived in conditions that would seem claustrophobic to anyone accustomed to surface ship accommodations, sharing bunks in hot bunking arrangements where sleep schedules rotated and personal space was measured in inches rather than feet. Every man aboard had a specific role that contributed to submarine operation, from the sonar operators who listened for enemy ships to the torpedo men, who maintained weapons and calculated firing solutions to the engineers who kept engines running and batteries charged and compressed air systems functioning properly. Submarine operations required coordination that approached telepathy when executed well, with crews that had trained together developing intuitive understanding of what needed to happen in combat situations where verbal orders would be too slow and where every second of delay could mean the difference between successful attack and catastrophic failure. The submarine was good, the design was sound, the construction was solid, the weapons worked as intended after fixes resolved the torpedo problems that had plagued early war operations, but metal and machinery meant nothing without leadership that could employ those capabilities effectively and crews that could execute under pressure. Other Gato-class submarines operating in the Pacific achieved respectable combat records through careful adherence to doctrine and patient exploitation of opportunities that minimized risk while maximizing probability of success. And some of those submarines would survive the war and return their crews home safely after conducting patrols that contributed to victory without spectacular individual achievements. Harder under Dealey's command would take a different path, one that prioritized impact over safety and that accepted risks other commanders rejected. And whether that approach represented brilliant tactical innovation or reckless gambling would be determined by results that unfolded over 4 days in June 1944, when the rules of submarine warfare stopped mattering and only outcomes would define success or failure. The first kill. The first destroyer appeared on sonar at a range of 8,000 yards, closing on a patrol course that would bring it directly across Harder's position if Dealey maintained current heading and depth, and the conventional response would be to alter course and slip away while the destroyer continued its search pattern unaware that an American submarine had detected it first and chosen evasion over engagement. Dealey watched the range close on the sonar plot, calculating the geometry of an intercept course that would position Harder for a bow shot at a target moving at 25 knots, and he made the decision that separated his approach from standard doctrine. Instead of evading, he would attack, and he would attack in a manner that gave the Japanese destroyer no warning and no opportunity to execute anti-submarine tactics before Harder's torpedoes found their target. The attack approach required closing to ranges that most submarine commanders avoided when engaging destroyers, ranges where the margin for error disappeared and where mechanical failure or calculation mistakes would result in detection and immediate depth charge attack that would destroy Harder before the crew could react. Dealey brought the submarine to periscope depth and confirmed visual contact on the destroyer, a ship silhouetted against afternoon sky and moving with the confident patrol rhythm of a vessel whose crew did not believe an American submarine would dare engage them in waters where Japanese destroyers operated with near impunity. The firing solution took shape as the torpedo officer calculated bearing and range and target speed, feeding data into the mechanical computer that would determine the precise moment to fire and the spread pattern that would maximize probability of at least one torpedo striking the destroyer amidships where damage would be catastrophic. At 1,500 yards, point-blank range for torpedo attacks where impact would come seconds after launch and where the destroyer's sonar might detect torpedo screws but would have no time to maneuver clear. Dealey ordered the first torpedo fired, then a second 2 seconds later, both weapons leaving their tubes with compressed air bursts that could be heard aboard the destroyer if anyone was listening carefully, but that came too late to matter because the torpedoes were already tracking toward their target at 46 knots. The wait between firing and impact lasted 28 seconds, half a minute during which Dealey maintained periscope observation and watched the destroyer's profile for any indication that lookouts had spotted torpedo wakes or that the ship was beginning emergency maneuvers that might carry it clear of the weapons tracking toward its hull. The first torpedo struck the destroyer just forward of amidships, detonating with a shock that Harder's crew felt through the water as pressure, wave, and sound, and the explosion tore through the destroyer's hull below the waterline in the engine room area where flooding would be immediate and catastrophic. The second torpedo hit 8 seconds later farther aft, ensuring that damage extended across enough of the ship's length that bulkheads could not contain flooding, and that the destroyer's fate was sealed regardless of what damage control efforts the crew attempted. Through the periscope, Dealey watched the destroyer list sharply to port as water poured through ruptured hull plates, watched crew members abandoning their stations as officers screamed orders that could not be executed because the ship was already dying, and watched the vessel slip beneath the surface bow first in less than 4 minutes from the moment the first torpedo struck. The immediate aftermath was not celebration but the grim recognition that Harder had just announced its presence to every Japanese ship and aircraft within detection range, that the explosion would bring reinforcements if any were nearby, and that the submarine needed to clear the area before additional destroyers arrived to conduct the anti-submarine search that would follow any ship sinking in these waters. Dealey ordered Harder deep and rigged for silent running, taking the submarine down to 250 feet while crew members secured equipment and machinery to minimize noise that might be detected by sonar. And for the next 3 hours, the submarine crept away from the attack site at 3 knots while above them the sounds of searching destroyers echoed through the water, depth charges detonating at ranges that suggested the Japanese were conducting area searches rather than targeting specific sonar contacts, but that were close enough to remind every man aboard that one miscalculation or one mechanical noise would bring those depth charges directly onto Harder's position. The psychological impact aboard the Japanese destroyer escort forces was immediate and profound, because destroyers were supposed to hunt submarines, not be hunted by them, and the sudden loss of a ship to a submarine attack in waters where destroyers had operated without significant threat created confusion and uncertainty that spread through radio communications as surviving ships reported what had happened and requested instructions for responding to a threat that doctrine had not adequately prepared them to counter. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine assumed submarines would evade destroyers, would prioritize survival over engagement, would never deliberately attack ships specifically designed to kill submarines, and the sinking that Dealey had just accomplished violated those assumptions so completely that the initial response from Japanese Naval Command was disbelief followed by demands for confirmation that an American submarine had actually engaged and sunk a destroyer rather than torpedoing a merchant ship that had been misidentified in initial reports. 4 days of relentless combat. What followed over the next 4 days would be described in Harder's patrol report with the understated language that characterized official naval communications, but the reality experienced by the crew was sustained combat that pushed men and machinery to limits where exhaustion and equipment failure became as dangerous as enemy action, and where every engagement brought the submarine closer to the moment when luck or skill would fail and depth charges would find their mark. Dealey did not withdraw after the first kill but continued operating in waters where Japanese destroyer patrols had intensified in response to the attack, deliberately positioning Harder where additional targets would appear and where conventional submarine doctrine would demand immediate withdrawal to safer operating areas. The second destroyer died 24 hours after the first, caught during a night surface transit when Harder detected the ship on radar before Japanese lookouts spotted the submarine's low profile against dark water. The attack followed the same pattern, close to point-blank range, fire multiple torpedoes to ensure hits, withdraw immediately after impact. But this time, the Japanese ship attempted to evade after detecting torpedo wakes, turning hard to port in a maneuver that would have succeeded against less precisely aimed weapons, but that could not defeat torpedoes launched from 1,500 yards by a crew that had spent months training for exactly these shots. The destroyer took 2 hits and sank in 6 minutes, going down so quickly that survival time for crew members in the water would be measured in minutes before hypothermia or sharks or simple exhaustion took them. The third and fourth kills came within 6 hours of each other, both destroyers caught while conducting anti-submarine searches for the American submarine that had sunk their sister ships, both victims of Dealey's tactical doctrine that treated destroyer patrols not as threats to evade but as opportunities to exploit. The pattern repeated with variations. Sonar contact at extreme range, approach to firing position using periscope observations to refine targeting data, torpedo spread launched at ranges where Japanese sonar might detect launch but could not react in time to prevent hits, and immediate withdrawal deep while explosions tore through destroyer hulls and sent ships to the bottom with most of their crews still aboard. Each engagement carried risks that increased as Japanese forces adjusted their search patterns and coordinated their anti-submarine efforts. Each withdrawal brought Harder through depth charge attacks that came closer to finding their target, and each successful evasion depended on crew performance that could not afford mistakes or equipment failures or moments of inattention that would turn hunter into hunted. The fifth destroyer presented the most dangerous engagement because Japanese tactics had evolved based on previous encounters, with ships maintaining irregular courses and varying speeds to make targeting more difficult, and with sonar operations intensified to detect submarines before those submarines could achieve firing positions. Dealey approached this target differently, accepting that conventional bow shots would be detected before torpedoes could be launched, and that the submarine needed tactical advantages beyond those provided by stealth alone. He positioned Harder where the destroyer's patrol pattern would bring the Japanese ship directly over the submarine's position, allowed the destroyer to pass overhead while Harder sat at 90 feet, and then fired a spread of torpedoes from the stern tubes at a target that was moving away, and that would have no warning of attack until weapons struck the hull from an angle that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine had not prepared crews to defend against. The destroyer took 3 hits across its stern quarter, lost propulsion and steering, and settled in the water while crew members prepared to abandon ship, and before rescue vessels could arrive, the ship capsized and sank, taking classified equipment and code materials to the bottom, where American intelligence would later attempt recovery but never succeed. The 4 days of sustained combat exhausted Harder's crew in ways that peacetime training could not replicate and that previous patrols had not approached, pushing men past the point where sleep deprivation and stress and constant awareness of mortality degraded performance and judgment. Dealey maintained combat discipline through personal example and through the recognition that his crew trusted his tactical decisions even when those decisions violated every rule of submarine warfare they had been taught, and that trust allowed Harder to continue operations in conditions where other submarines would have withdrawn to regroup or where crews might have refused orders that seemed suicidal to anyone not understanding the geometric and tactical calculations that made Dealey's approach viable. The price paid was measured in years of life that each crew member lost to stress and exhaustion and the psychological weight of knowing that every engagement could be their last. But the impact achieved was measured in Japanese destroyer forces that stopped operating with confidence and started operating with fear that an American submarine might be lurking anywhere waiting to attack ships that were supposed to be hunters rather than prey. The psychological impact. The reports that reached Japanese Naval Command in the days following Harder's attacks created confusion and concern that escalated as additional destroyers failed to return from patrols, and as survivors described an American submarine that engaged rather than evaded, and that seemed to target destroyers specifically rather than avoiding them as American submarines were supposed to do. The loss of 5 destroyers in 4 days to a single submarine represented tactical impossibility according to every doctrine the Japanese Navy had developed for anti-submarine warfare, and the initial response from senior commanders was to question whether survivors were misidentifying events or whether multiple submarines were operating in the area and being reported as a single boat. The investigation that followed confirmed that one American submarine, USS Harder, based on intelligence intercepts and survivor accounts, had sunk 5 destroyers through aggressive tactics that contradicted everything Japanese forces expected from American submarine operations. The psychological impact spread through destroyer escort forces who recognized that their ships were no longer safe from submarine attack, that the protective role they filled for merchant convoys and capital ships now carried personal risk that previous operations had not involved, and that American submarines might be evolving tactics that turned the tables on the relationship between submarines and their hunters. Japanese destroyer captains began operating with increased caution, maintaining higher patrol speeds that made targeting more difficult but that also increased fuel consumption and reduced patrol durations, conducting more frequent sonar searches that revealed nothing but that consumed crew attention and created alert fatigue, and requesting additional ships for escort duties because the confidence that had characterized previous operations had been replaced by awareness that submarines might be anywhere and might attack without warning. The fear that developed was not irrational panic but the realistic assessment that submarines commanded by officers willing to engage destroyers created tactical situations where Japanese ships could not rely on conventional doctrine to protect them, where evasion and sonar sweeps might not be sufficient to prevent attack, and where losses would continue until American submarines were destroyed or until Japanese forces developed countertactics that addressed the new threat. The problem was that developing effective countertactics required understanding what the American submarine commander was thinking and predicting where he would position his boat for attacks, and Dealey's approach was sufficiently different from standard American submarine doctrine that Japanese intelligence officers studying the attacks could not reliably predict his next moves or recommend defensive measures beyond the obvious advice to increase vigilance and maintain irregular patrol patterns that would make targeting more difficult. Admiral Ozawa flees Toi. Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet from his headquarters at Toi in the Philippines, where he had concentrated major surface units including carriers and battleships in preparation for the decisive fleet engagement that Japanese naval planning assumed would determine control of the Pacific and either stop American advances or allow them to continue toward the Japanese home islands. The anchorage at Taitoi provided strategic positioning for operations against American forces, but it also placed the fleet in waters where American submarines operated with increasing effectiveness and where the loss of destroyer escorts to submarine attack created vulnerabilities that Ozawa could not ignore without risking his capital ships to torpedo attacks that might cripple the fleet before the decisive battle could even begin. The reports that reached Ozawa in mid-June 1944 detailed the loss of 5 destroyers in 4 days to a single American submarine operating near Taitoi, losses that represented more than simple attrition but that threatened the fleet's ability to conduct anti-submarine operations and protect valuable carriers and battleships from the submarine threat that American forces were demonstrating with increasing effectiveness. The destroyers lost were not replaceable on timelines that mattered for upcoming operations, and their loss meant that remaining escorts would be stretched thinner across defensive responsibilities, and that gaps in anti-submarine coverage would develop that American submarines could exploit. Ozawa faced a decision that would have strategic implications regardless of which option he chose: remain at Taitoi and accept that his fleet was vulnerable to submarine attack, or depart earlier than planned and move to waters where American submarine presence was less concentrated but where his fleet would be forced to operate according to timelines that had not been optimized for the coming engagement. On June 13, 1944, Ozawa ordered the mobile fleet to depart Taitoi and proceed toward the Marianas, where American forces were conducting amphibious operations that Japanese planning had identified as the likely trigger for the decisive naval battle. The departure came earlier than tactical planning had recommended because the submarine threat at Taitoi had become untenable, because remaining in place would expose the fleet to continued submarine attacks that might sink or damage capital ships before they could participate in battle, and because the psychological impact of losing destroyers to an aggressive American submarine had created uncertainty among fleet commanders who questioned whether their current anchorage provided the security that operations required. The early departure forced the fleet to operate on compressed timelines, reduced the training time available for air groups that were still working up to combat readiness, and positioned Japanese forces for engagement before all elements were prepared for the kind of combat that the upcoming battle would demand. The strategic consequences of that early departure would unfold over the following days as the mobile fleet moved toward the Marianas and positioned itself for what would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the engagement where American carrier aircraft would achieve one of the most lopsided victories in naval aviation history in what pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The connection between Harder's attacks and that outcome was not direct or simple, because many factors contributed to the Japanese defeat, including American technological advantages and superior pilot training and tactical coordination that Japanese forces could not match. But the timing of Ozawa's departure from Taitoi and the compressed preparation timeline that resulted from that departure created conditions that favored American forces and that contributed to Japanese disadvantages in an engagement where margins mattered and where every hour of additional training might have meant better Japanese performance and different outcomes. Breaking naval aviation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began on June 19, 1944, when Japanese carrier aircraft launched against American task forces in attacks that Japanese planning assumed would achieve the kind of success that had characterized earlier carrier engagements, but that instead resulted in catastrophic losses as American fighters intercepted Japanese strikes and shot down aircraft with efficiency that approached massacre rather than combat. The Japanese lost more than 300 aircraft in a single day, losses that represented not just machines but pilots whose training could not be replaced on any timeline that mattered for the war's outcome. And the American victory was so complete that the battle marked the effective end of Japanese naval aviation as a strategic force capable of contesting American control of the Pacific. The factors that contributed to that outcome were multiple and complex. American radar allowed early detection of Japanese strikes and gave fighters time to intercept before Japanese aircraft reached their targets. American pilot training was superior and emphasized gunnery and tactics that Japanese training did not match. American aircraft were newer and more capable than the older Japanese models that had not been replaced due to production limitations, and American anti-aircraft fire from surface ships was devastatingly effective due to proximity-fused shells that detonated near aircraft even without direct hits. But underlying all those tactical and technological advantages was the reality that Japanese forces had been forced to engage before they were ready, that air groups had not completed training that would have prepared them for the kind of combat they encountered, and that the early departure from Taitoi had compressed timelines in ways that left Japanese forces less prepared than they might have been if Ozawa had remained at his anchorage until tactical readiness was achieved. The connection between USS Harder's attacks and the timing of that engagement was cause and effect rather than coincidence, though the connection operated through layers of decision-making and strategic planning that made the relationship indirect rather than immediately obvious. Dealey's destruction of 5 destroyers created the security threat that forced Ozawa to depart Tai early. That early departure compressed training and preparation timelines. Those compressed timelines meant Japanese air groups engaged American forces before achieving full combat readiness. And that lack of readiness contributed to the catastrophic losses that ended Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. The chain of causation was clear even if individual links were separated by time and distance and layers of command decision-making. And the result was that one submarine's aggressive attacks on destroyers helped shape the conditions that led to one of the most decisive naval battles of the Pacific War. The cost of aggression. USS Harder continued operations through the summer of 1944, conducting additional patrols and sinking more Japanese ships through the aggressive tactics that had defined Dealey's command. But the odds that governed submarine warfare were not suspended simply because a commander was skilled or because previous engagements had succeeded. On August 24, 1944, Harder was operating off the Philippines when Japanese anti-submarine forces detected the submarine and conducted a depth charge attack that was either more accurate or more lucky than previous attacks had been, and the submarine was lost with all hands, Dealey and his entire crew dying in the same waters where they had hunted Japanese destroyers and changed the tactical dynamics of submarine warfare in the Pacific. The loss was not unexpected by anyone who understood the risks Dealey accepted every time he chose engagement over evasion, who recognized that aggressive submarine warfare pushed odds past sustainable limits, and who knew that commanders who broke rules eventually paid prices for that decision regardless of how successful previous rule-breaking had been. The question that survived Dealey's death was whether his approach represented brilliant tactical innovation that other submarine commanders should emulate or whether it represented unsustainable risk-taking that achieved short-term success at the cost of long-term survival. And the Navy's answer to that question was complicated by the recognition that Dealey's tactics had worked and had achieved strategic impact that conventional submarine operations might not have accomplished, but that the price paid was the loss of an exceptional commander and crew who could not be replaced. The legacy that remained was measured not in the specific ships Dealey sank or even in the strategic impact his actions had on the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but in the demonstration that submarine warfare could be conducted offensively rather than defensively, that destroyers were not invulnerable to submarines commanded by officers willing to accept risks that conventional doctrine warned against, and that tactical innovation sometimes required breaking rules that had been written to prevent exactly the kind of combat that Dealey proved could be conducted successfully if execution was precise and if commanders understood the geometry and timing that made aggressive tactics viable. Other submarine commanders would study Harder's patrol reports and learn from Dealey's approach. Some would attempt to replicate his tactics with varying degrees of success, and the evolution of American submarine warfare in the final year of the Pacific War would reflect the lessons that the air inside USS Harder smelled like diesel fuel mixed with human sweat and the sharp metallic tang of fear, and in the dim red lighting of the control room on that June morning in 1944, Commander Samuel D. Dealey stood perfectly still at the periscope while his sonar operator called out ranges that were decreasing with mathematical precision and terrible speed. The Japanese destroyers were closing at 30 knots, their screws churning the Philippine Sea into white foam as they charged toward the last known position of the American submarine that had been operating in waters they considered their own. And every man aboard Harder understood without being told that the next few minutes would determine whether they returned home or joined the dozens of American submarines that had disappeared beneath these same waters without trace or survivors. The sonar pings came faster now, deliberate and methodical, the sound of professionals who knew their trade and had practiced it against dozens of submarines over 3 years of Pacific combat. 2 destroyers working in coordination, one slightly ahead of the other, executing a textbook anti-submarine search pattern that would force Harder to choose between diving deeper into waters where pressure would eventually crush the hull or remaining at periscope depth where torpedoes could be fired but where depth charges would find their target with devastating accuracy. Dealey's executive officer stood 3 feet away, waiting for the order that every submarine officer in the Pacific Fleet would give in this situation, the order that doctrine demanded and common sense required and survival depended upon. Dive deep, rig for silent running, evade until the destroyers lost contact or gave up the search. Every submarine commander in the United States Navy knew the fundamental rule that separated the living from the dead, the rule that had been written in blood and burning oil across 3 years of undersea warfare from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. You do not fight destroyers. You avoid them when possible, evade them when detected, and run from them when they begin an attack run, because destroyers were purpose-built submarine killers equipped with sonar that could track submerged boats, depth charges that could crush steel hulls like eggshells, speed that no submarine could match on the surface or submerged, and crews trained specifically to locate and destroy submarines before those submarines could threaten the merchant ships and carriers and battleships that destroyers were assigned to protect. A submarine that engaged a destroyer accepted odds that favored the surface ship by margins so wide that engagement was classified as suicide rather than combat, and commanders who ignored this reality tended to die young along with their entire crews. Dealey looked through the periscope one more time, calculating ranges and bearings and closure rates with the instinct that came from 20 months of combat patrols and a mind that thought in terms of angles and speeds and geometric solutions to problems that most people would classify as impossible. The destroyers were executing their search pattern perfectly, maintaining separation that prevented a single torpedo spread from threatening both ships, coordinating their sonar sweeps to eliminate blind spots, closing the range in a manner that suggested their commanders expected the American submarine to dive and run the way American submarines always did when confronted by superior surface forces. The textbook response was so predictable that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine was built entirely around the assumption that submarines would behave rationally, would prioritize survival over engagement, would trade potential torpedo shots for the certainty of living to fight another day. Instead of ordering the dive that would take Harder to 300 feet and safety, instead of following the doctrine that had been drilled into him at submarine school and reinforced through patrol after patrol, instead of doing what every other submarine commander in the Pacific would do in identical circumstances, Samuel Dealey made a decision that contradicted everything his training had taught him about submarine warfare and everything his experience had shown him about the balance of power between submarines and destroyers. He called out firing solutions to his torpedo officer, adjusted the periscope bearing to track the lead destroyer, and prepared to do what the Japanese commanders racing toward him would never expect and what his own crew would later describe as either brilliance or madness depending on whether the torpedoes found their targets. Instead of running, he turned straight toward them. The most dangerous enemy at sea. Destroyers represented the ultimate evolution of anti-submarine warfare, ships designed from the keel up to locate and kill submarines with an efficiency that made surface combat against them nearly suicidal for any submarine captain who chose engagement over evasion. The standard Japanese destroyer displaced 1,500 tons, could achieve speeds exceeding 35 knots that made them faster than any submarine on the surface and vastly faster than submarines running submerged, and carried depth charge racks that could rain high explosive charges into the water in patterns calculated to bracket and destroy submarines whose exact positions might be uncertain but whose general locations had been determined by sonar contact. Each depth charge contained 300 pounds of explosives fused to detonate at preset depths, and a pattern of 6 to 8 charges dropped in rapid succession could create an underwater kill zone where pressure waves and shrapnel would rupture submarine hulls even without direct hits, flooding compartments and crushing crew members and sending boats to the bottom before anyone aboard could react or escape. The sonar equipment aboard Japanese destroyers had improved dramatically since the war's beginning, evolving from primitive hydrophones that could barely detect submarines at close range to active sonar systems that could ping targets and track them through evasive maneuvers, providing continuous updates on submarine position and depth that allowed depth charge attacks to be precisely calculated rather than randomly delivered. A destroyer working alone posed significant threat to any submarine, but destroyers operating in pairs or groups could coordinate their attacks in ways that made escape nearly impossible, boxing in submarines and forcing them into positions where depth charges could be delivered with near certainty of success. The doctrine was simple and brutally effective. Locate the submarine through sonar, maneuver to achieve optimal attack position, drop depth charges in calculated patterns, and maintain contact until the submarine either surfaced or broke apart underwater and disappeared from sonar screens forever. American submarine training emphasized avoidance of destroyers whenever possible and evasion when avoidance failed, teaching commanders to think of destroyers not as targets but as threats to be circumvented through stealth and patience and the willingness to abandon attacks on merchant ships if destroyer escorts appeared on sonar. The mathematics of submarine versus destroyer combat favored the surface ship by margins that made engagement irrational. Destroyers could move